Hello, I'm Joseph, and today I want to talk about Go in the context of a PHP developer. Somebody who is used to just maybe logging into a server, doing code changes on production, or just having that really quick iteration or developer loop where you're not having to wait for things to compile and you can just make your code change, go to the browser, refresh, and get that experience. Go is unique for a multitude of things, but I think that the developer loop is probably be the most critical, as that's the one that's usually the most kind of difficult to nail, specifically for something that's a compiled language. So I'm just going to show you something real quick here. So I have, welcome to the home page. I'm going to go ahead and change this. I'm going to go ahead and put some exclamation marks here. So 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And by the time I get to the browser and refresh, it's already there. Now, if you're on a slower machine, it might take a titch longer, but I am using what's called Air. There's another one called Refresh and some other stuff out there, but Air is probably the one I'm most familiar with. And they recently added a feature called Proxy, which is a live reload built into the Air runtime, and you don't have to add anything. All you do is add the proxy port and the port to your web application in the Air configuration. And so here is the same example. This is on port 8090, not 8000. And now all I have to do is, delete it, save it, and then it reloads it. So I don't have to do any live reload GS and set up a different live reload process or anything else like that. If you have something like Temple, which is what I'm using here, that needs to take a language, compiled it down to Go, and then recompile your runtime, it's doing all of that while also restarting your web server. So I think that's the most critical thing to take away as terms of the developer loop. The other thing that's very problematic in the world of PHP is that there's still a ton of sites on 5.6, some 5.4, and you are having to make these massive jumps between these languages. And it's really difficult sometimes. And you're going anywhere between like just a really simple framework to something like Laravel, Symfony, or working within WordPress, Drupal, Magento, Moodle, you name it. And with Go, so much is already built into the language in the context of web development that you are not expected to be working on these monolithic web frameworks. They just don't really exist in the Go ecosystem. On top of that, when you think about having to deal with that really old version of PHP, with Go, your runtime is shipped with your web application. And be like, okay, well, how can I deploy this? You can deploy this on shared hosting. It is that simple. You can do a CGI or fast CGI. And as long as the shared hosting provider supports that, then you can deploy your Go application. It does not matter what version of Go you're using. There's a caveat to that in that you do have to let go of CGO, which is linking to glibc. So this way there's no linking involved and it's a static build of your runtime. And so if you're using any Go libraries that reach out to C libraries, that's not going to work. But you still got things like you can connect to your database like MySQL. You can do password hashing with bcrypt, but not link it. You have access to JSON Web Tokens and encryption and stuff like that. You can do image processing because it's built into the Go runtime as well. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do without having the need to reach for a C library. And there's a big need to want to avoid using the Go or C libraries inside of Go for that reason, for this deliverability, because I can build it on this machine. It's really good at cross-platform compiling. So you can be on Windows or Mac, doesn't matter, but you can build for Linux, you can build for AMD 64 or ARM, and you just deploy it. You copy it, the binary to your web application or your web hosting solution, whether it's shared hosting, VPS, cloud hosting, dedicated server, does not matter. If it's Linux and it's built for Linux and AMD 64 processor or 64 processor for, the x86 stuff, it's going to run. You don't have to worry about any other stuff. Now, obviously, you're going to have things like maybe migration scripts or the JavaScript stuff or styling or images, maybe an upload folder, all those things. You can orchestrate how you want to deploy, but the main runtime is in a binary, which also in PHP, like something we used to do a lot, or at least worry about, was when we were selling stuff, which doesn't really happen much today, but you would use like IonCube or Zen encoder or whatever else to try to obfuscate in protect the source code. With the Go runtime, it's all bundled into a binary, so you don't have to really worry about that. If the client doesn't pay you, you can just walk away, and they won't have any of your source code. They might have the binary, but they won't have the source code. So I think that's also really cool. The fact that you're getting really easy developer loop, not really easy, but you're getting a really fast developer loop. You're getting easy deployment. You're getting whatever version you want to work on for Go. And then in terms of the language, that's where things get a little bit more iffy. So in PHP, if you're used to interfaces, traits, and object-oriented programming, you're going to kind of a tough time getting into Go and settling down. It is mostly, when you think about like procedural and imperative code, top-down type of stuff, that's what Go is. But it has some mechanics to deal with issues. It has some object-oriented properties, but that's really it. It's not really a functional language, and you do more like composition than you do over encapsulation. There's some ways to kind of handle it, but I'll give you a couple examples here. So for example, in the database, I have a custom structure called null type, and my null type is just a struct right here. And so I put in the time, and if it's basically valid, which is null or not. When I go to read that in from my SQL database, you usually use scan, and scan is typical for any of the database operations to pull in a record item, whether it be like or be a column of a record item, and you would like comment element it. If you implement the scan function into your struct here, which is what this is doing, you can now use scan, the typical way that you'd read in stuff, and not have to extend the scan class or wrap the scan class into another class to make it easier to call. You don't have to do any of that stuff. And for me, it's like the prototypical with the early JavaScript days, or monkey patching with the Ruby system, but it's all statically typed, it's checked, and you don't have to really worry about it, like all these weird functions pop up out of nowhere from some other library that you weren't quite sure how it worked. There's some global namespace stuff that you do have to sometimes deal with, but there are packages and ways you deal with that as well. And there's not really much to it. Like there's another like little tidbit of a thing that was a little bit of an annoying thing for me, which is there's no optional parameters. And what you would do is you would wrap another function around that function via composition, and then you would provide that as like an optional parameter type of thing. To kind of show you a bit more about what I'm talking about there, if I go back to my main file here, if I go to here, my handlers are wrapped around something else, and like this one's wrapped around something else that's wrapped around something else. So it's kind of get the idea. So app context for me is my database connection that I put into, or I have available, but it's not globally available. And I'm passing it into my function, or I can implement something, like I can implement this register handle on top of my app context. So if I had done that, let's say if I did do that, what it would look like is I would take this, instead of it being a parameter, I mean, passing it into via a function parameter, I would take this and then add this here. And then when I want to access it, I would do like app.register, if I could type register handler. It'll be accessed that way rather than just register handler. But that's attaching it to the structure here. So that's how that would work. It's a little bit of weird, but you can notice that I'm not implementing in the function or in the file that was there. So it just makes it a little bit easier to deal with some of these edge cases where you need to add functionality to something, but you don't necessarily want to be copying in the code and manually changing it yourself. You can just add on to that via the structure by appending it to your function in the front. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but that's the best way I see it. It's basically just prototypical, or the monkey patching type of way. But you have an understanding of exactly where it's implemented at, and what library it's coming from. Okay. That was pretty simple. The other thing that is going to be critical is you can upload this to shared hosting. via CGI or fast CGI. So I'm going to show you this little bit of code here. This takes the environmental variable, which I load through a .env file up here. So pretty straightforward. That's what this is right here. That's a .env file. It's just like an ini file or something like that. And I swap between HTTP serve and fast CGI serve. Effectively the same exact, it is the same exact runtime. All I'm doing is changing something in a separate file to trigger whether this is going to be running as an HTTP server, a dedicated HTTP server, which is why I have my static folder up here, or if it's going to be running as fast CGI underneath Apache's fcgid with its configuration. And so that lets me have one build that can do both of those things. And then you'd be like, okay, well, how complicated is it? Now, I've made a dedicated video on this specifically already in terms of getting it deployed on shared hosting, but I'm going to show you what you would typically do with htaccess and like PHP is you would normally have something like this. This is the mod rewrite. This is so you don't have to have like your main.cgi or your index.cgi or index.fcgi or whatever you're going to call it in your URL all the time, just like you would have index.php / whatever or question mark. You really don't want that in your URL. And so all you do is you add your handler. So fcgi script for fast CGI, or if you're just using regular CGI, then you have CGI script. And that's it. This is just some extra little icing on the cake, which is when I get to a subfolder, it will automatically choose that as like the index rather than index PHP or index CGI. This is just a different name that I've attached to it. And then the last bit here is just to protect a couple of things. So .env file, if I have that there, they can't, load it up and read the passwords. If it's some SQL files, something like that, they can't find out my database. In terms of my migrations, I'm using what's called Goose, and it's just basically SQL. There's nothing really special here. Goose up, Goose down. Pretty straightforward. You can have dedicated Go files for seeding. So like I had one thing where it goes to online, goes to a GitHub repository, downloads a CSV of zip codes, imports it into the database. And that's my seeding process. And because this is either a separate command or you can embed it in your runtime, which is what I do here, every time I deploy this to a brand new server, it will automatically redeploy everything it needs to. So I'm not having to manually run migrations. It will do it automatically, which is sometimes good and bad. You'll choose how you want that to run, but you're choosing that. So like in my main file or my main function back up here, I'm specifically embedding or calling Goose migration there. And it's a relatively path to wherever the binary is running from. So pretty straightforward. My database connection here too. So I'm not doing anything special here. And yeah, I mean, there's not really too much in terms of like the whole setup process. I do have a bunch of stuff I do want to also show. So in the beyond this that live reload thing, I have JSON Web Tokens implemented, register system. I haven't added my account login yet, but async work. Async is another thing that's a really big pain in PHP that is built into Go via Go routines. So here is some async work. It fires off 5 channels or 5 asynchronous bits of work and then gets back to results. They wait 5 seconds each. This would have taken 25 seconds, but instead it only takes 5. If you did this in PHP, your only way to do this in the context of PHP FBM or mod PHP or whatever else is used that it doesn't have the ability to yield or fiber, you have to use curl async to call to your own web page, your web hosting site, back to a different script that can do that asynchronous work, and then you get the overhead of another connection of another database thing, all that stuff. And here it's built into the runtime. You don't have to worry about it. Now, if you're doing this with CGI and not fast CGI versus HTTP and everything else, the issue is that CGI waits until the process is complete before it will feed it into the browser. So if you're hoping to maybe get a response out before you start your async work, that's not going to happen. That's not how, and some of this is because of the CGI limitation, but also when you're working with fast CGI, there's 2 mechanisms that you're going to be kind of dealing with. One is what's called the buffer in Apache specifically. And when it runs fast CGI, you can't, like, if you want to do HTTP2 stuff, not really going to work. But if you want to like terminate early, get the header out, get like the first bit of the head of your HTML into the browser, you can't do that because it waits. It has a buffer before it flushes it, even though you're explicitly flushing in your Go code. Again, I've already made a whole video on this specifically, but you kind of get the idea. But at least in fast CGI, you can do asynchronous work. And you can try to output, but again, you have to hit that buffer, or you can literally do background work. You can have things running in the background in your Go application. So for example, here I have a background start task. This sets, like, this has triggered something. So it gave me back a response, but it's now running in the background. Every 10 seconds, it will write something to a file, and then I can go ahead and stop that too. Now, unfortunately, because it's running as fast CGI, depends on your hosting provider that's doing this. There's a certain length that it's allowed to run at. Apache's default is 1 hour. That's what I have it on my hosting provider too. So this will run for a full hour doing a background job, but it's of when that process, the fast CGI process, started. It's not when I start the background job. So you kind of get the idea of what could potentially happen if I had something that was in the middle of something, but it hits that 1 hour marker, it's just going to prematurely terminate. So not always the best thing, but to be able to do both asynchronous work and just completely background work that's not going to block your request is really nice to have, specifically in a shared environment where you're struggling around like all the stuff that you're doing with PHP to get this to work via, a cron tab job with *** or curl async. Beyond that, there's not too much else to say. Like, I have an image upload script here. Server-side events work in HTTP mode. They don't work in the proxy mode. So like, for example, if I try to do it here, it will not send me any results. That's because the proxy is using server-side events. But if I do that via the regular, didn't mean to do that. Okay, well, let's go back. If I do that via the regular non-proxy version, I will get server-side events actually coming through. If it's running as fast CGI, you have to bust the buffer of that 64 kilobytes or whatever's default by Apache or your hosting provider. That's not really going to work, so you can't do server-side events in fast CGI. You kind of get the idea. There's some limitations, obviously, that's going to happen. You can't run WebSockets in fast CGI. So if you're running shared hosting, you don't automatically get these magical gRPC, WebSockets, server-side events all available to you because it's limited to what Apache can do with its FCGI module, and it can't do that, basically. Okay, so again, not much else to say or do. It's just there's a lot to kind of take in terms of that developer work experience, the runtime that's portable, the relatively easy language to learn. The other thing I'm going to show is the template, the language or templating system I'm using called Temple. I think it's called Temple or TPM, TPML, whatever, TPML something. And it has a fairly simple thing here where it looks like Go. Like if you think of like React, JSX type of stuff, or even just doing some PHP stuff, like I guess more akin to like Blade in Laravel, where you're not specifically putting the PHP start ends. That's kind of what this is doing. It has some special mode way of doing it. The only gotcha with this currently is that there's just syntax highlighting. This is both in Visual Studio Code and in GoLand for JetBrains editor, and you just get syntax highlighting. There's things like I can't format any of this code. I have to manually, like, there's 2 spaces here, but there's 4 spaces here. I have to manually format that by shift tabbing or manually spacing it out. It's a little bit of an annoying thing, but this lets me have code that looks like Go, but embedded in the actual thing. And there's other Go template things out there. There's things more akin to Mustache or to Twig. If you don't like this or you want better integration, GoLand itself, I know that they provide type completion for Go templates specifically that's built into Go. You do like Go type : and then you can actually get like typed information from the parameters that you're working with. But this is, good enough in terms of like what I'm showing here. It's not really complicated, and you can use JavaScript. You can do all these things. They have a little bit of a React-esque type of thing. So for example, in my index here, I have layout, and layout has this pulls in the request, or you pass in the request and it looks for HS request. So if you're using HXML or HTMX, sorry, it will look at the request and then only feedback what is encapsulated for the children. So if you are doing a brand new request, so for example, I'll go ahead and show you the register page. So if I go to register, did I break something here? I did. So let's go ahead and do error again. So if we do register and I click on it, it loads the entire request. It's pretty straightforward. But if I go ahead and inspect this and I click on the register and I look at the actual request that came in via network, I guess I gotta do this again. So let's go home. Actually, I can do this rather than just going home. I can just click on sign up. The feedback that came back here, if I go to XHR, look at register and pull this up here and go to response and click on raw, it's only the content that's in there. That's what HTMX was generally designed to. You kind of get this spa-esque single page application experience where you're not loading up the header and stuff, which figures out if you're logged in or not, maybe does some database requests on top of that. Here, I'm only sending that back. And through Temple, I can really, really simplify that by wrapping it into my layout, but it has that little curly brace as the children that gets injected into my layout component. So I can, and inside my layout component, I'm hiding that logic of if it's, in an HX request, I'm only going to do a partial response, and I don't need to do all the logic of, hey, here's the navigation, are you logged in or not? Show these buttons if you are or not. None of that stuff needs to be thought about re-rendered. I'm assuming there's some performance penalty for using Temple anyways, but it gives you all the Go code regardless. Like you can actually see what's happening here, so you can have a better idea if you're going to do some perf or anything else like that. If debugging, pretty simple. You would set up something called Delve, and you can set up debugger through Docker or through this directly. If you do Docker, you got remote debugging. In Golang, it's pretty straightforward to work with Visual Studio Code. It's a little bit of a nuisance. There's like classic mode and something else you got to be dealing with to get debugging to work. But you can have Delve with Air and have that live reload process. Will also attach to the debugger. The debugger, when the process is restarted, will reconnect automatically. Really, really cool stuff for, like, again, that developer workflow. A couple other things, I like have Ansible set up. So if I need to do a remote deployment, I can. Now that takes about 25 seconds, which is very long because I do have another deploy script I made of everything that I would have been doing in Ansible. And it's just simply SSH to server, delete the fastCGI file, which terminates the process in Apache, and then upload the new main one, and then change the permissions to 755 or just executable, because that's what's required to get fastCGI to actually run on shared hosting. And that's it. And that takes like 2 to 3 seconds. That's it. So, you can deploy how you want. I can manually go to the server here and upload it as I want to. Pretty straightforward for that as well, because it's built into Golang for remote browsing and stuff like that. So everything, if you're used to PHP Storm, you're going to be used to Golang. A lot of the similar stuff here is available. I have my database, so I can go directly to my database, look at it, and look at the tables. This needs to be refreshed actually. So let me go ahead and, why is this not? I think I have to re-putting the password, which I think is password. Oh, I don't have the driver downloaded. Test connection. Download drivers, and okay, change password. There we go. So got that, refresh it. Now I have all that. I have access to my users. Pretty typical stuff. So nothing else to really say. I just wanted to give my little tidbit of information from a perspective of a PHP developer using Go as a kind of the experience I would do in PHP anyways. And yeah, in terms of like productivity, I'm not really noticing that much of a drop. The only gotcha is obviously you kind of have to learn this stuff. You're building up your knowledge base. You're building up some core functions that you'd be putting together. Because again, there are web frameworks, but they're not these large monolithic ones. And most of the times you don't need to be getting that complicated. And for me, I've done auth so many times. I've done JSON Web Token so many times. I don't need it to be all hooked in some pretty fancy web framework. And just to have it all at my fingertips to always change at any little bit of thing is nice. Like for example, with Laravel, I had to do some custom edits with the signing process of JSON Web Tokens because it has an expiration date. That was embedded. It was by default. Was told to the client that these last for a year. People started using their API, and then it stopped working. They're like, hey, what's going on? I'm like, yeah, well, they just need to renew the tokens. Like, we have like thousands of these people using this. We can't ask them to all update. Like these people have to pay money to get these reintegrated into that. I'm like, okay, well, how can I do this? Well, I got to read in the web token, look at the scope and everything else, and the signature of how it was created, and then create a lifetime allowed JSON Web Token versus an expired one. And doing that through Laravel, having to jump through all the different layers to have that ability to manually override and ignore the expiration if it's of this type of subject and stuff like that was a big pain in the butt. But because it's already here and it's very simple, I can just change it anytime I want. It's not that big of a deal. Yeah. Anyways, if you guys have any questions or comments or suggestions or corrections, please let me know. I'll be interested.